Greetings and welcome to TrainSignal. You're watching Design and Manage an Exchange Infrastructure. This is a primary heading for the 70-341 Exchange 2013 Core Solutions exam. The subtopic for this lesson is Administer Exchange Workload Management. Under the subject Administer Exchange Workload Management, this objective may include, but is not limited to, configure user workload policies, configure system workload policies, monitor system workload events, and monitor user workload events. From a scenario perspective, well, this might look familiar to you. The company is actually our own company, Exchange. Now the problem here is that as a design and deployment consultancy, we need to be on top of all of the latest features and tools in Exchange 2013, including Exchange Workload Management. Now, user workload management, that's the new name for the user throttling features that actually existed in Exchange Server 2010. So it's not necessarily a new feature, but just renamed and connected in with a new feature in Exchange 2013 called System Workload Management. Either way, we need to be prepared to understand these solutions. So our goal is to review the new Exchange Workload Management features in the event we ever need to utilize them. Now, let me make it really clear from the outset here. Let's jump outside of character for a moment. This is not something that you would be worrying about as a typical Exchange administrator. This runs all by itself, Exchange Workload Management, and you'll see that the setup for it is actually just fine. I'm going to explain what you could do if you wanted to or needed to change it. But most of you, if not all of you listening, will never, ever need to touch this. This is definitely one of those subjects that you need to know because A, it's part of Exchange 2013, so you should know it, you should know that it exists, and B, it will be on the certification exam. And it's subjects like this, those way out in left field type subjects, that often find themselves into test questions. Okay, we've jumped outside of the scenario, let's jump back into the scenario and let's get started with Exchange Workload Management. So what exactly is Exchange Workload Management? Well, it helps to optimize the resource utilization of your servers to provide the best user experience. What it does is it balances high and low priority processes, and it provides more resources to high priority processes when required. Exchange Workload Management monitors key resources like the CPU, mailbox database RPC latency, mailbox database replication health, content indexing retry queue size, and content indexing age of last notification. Based on the consumption of these resources, Exchange manages the workload without degrading the user experience. Again, all of this happens behind the scenes. Let's break it down a little bit further. So for starters, what exactly is an Exchange workload? Well, it's a feature, or a protocol, or a service. Really, it's anything that consumes resources. So as far as resources, when we look at what Exchange workload consumes, the system resources include CPU, mailbox database operations, Active Directory requests to run user requests or background work. So some good examples of what an Exchange workload might be include Outlook Web App, ActiveSync, a mailbox migration, mailbox assistance. All of these things are Exchange workloads. And you have the ability to monitor the health of resources or control or throttle how end users use resources to manage workloads personally. So you can get your hands in there and you can actually make adjustments to the way the system uses resources or adjustments to the way the end users use resources. You can do that. However, it's all configured initially by default. As we already mentioned, controlling how resources are consumed by individual end users, this was possible with Exchange 2010. It has been expanded for Exchange Server 2013, so it's not necessarily the same feature. It has been increased in terms of capability. But managing workloads based on the health of system resources, this is definitely new in Exchange Server 2013. Let's talk for a moment about peaks and valleys. When it comes to Exchange workload management, when resource health degrades, workloads connected to it dynamically throttle. This is also known as shaving the peaks. And when resources are healthy, then they can speed up, which is also known as filling the valleys. I know they're goofy terms, but you'll see it in the TechNet descriptions for some of these things. Now, workloads are assigned classifications. There's urgent, customer expectation, internal maintenance, and discretionary. Policies determine if the resource is underloaded, overloaded, or critical. Let's take a look now at a list of Exchange workloads and default throttling thresholds used by Exchange. So here we are in TechNet, and we're looking at an article entitled Workload Management Reference. This article will be linked off to in the additional research at the end of this lesson. The important part here is for you to get a chance to see that as we scroll down, beyond terminology, you can see Exchange workloads and classifications. And you can see here on the right, urgent, customer expectation, and so on. And you can see here the workload policy name. And as we scroll down, we can see internal maintenance still, and then discretionary. So for each of these different policies, there's a description and then a workload classification. As we go down a little further, we can see the percentages that indicate whether or not the workload classification is underloaded, overloaded, or critical. And depending on the actual resource, like in this case we see local server CPU, or mailbox database RPC latency, mailbox database replication health, content indexing retry queue size, and mailbox database availability health. And you can see again the various thresholds and the items that match up to those thresholds depending on whether or not it's discretionary, internal maintenance, customer expectation, or urgent. And all of this is configurable through the Exchange Management Shell. But again, my recommendation is 99.999% of the time to leave this alone. Do not go changing the workload classification, thresholds, the percentages, and so forth. Leave this alone unless you really know what you're changing and why. Now, as far as the settings, you can also view the Exchange 2013 threshold values from the shell. You run get-resource policy with a format list. Let's just jump over to the server and take a look at this. Alright, so here we see that we are on our Exchange server. We're looking at the Exchange Management Shell, and what we want to do first is take a look at the workload policies and workload classifications that are currently set up in our environment. So to do that, we type in get-workload policy, and if we just hit enter, there we can see all of the different workload policies, and we can see the various classifications and so forth. So we took a look at that through our TechNet article, through the chart that was listed there, but now we can see it here in the Exchange Management Shell. Now, in addition to that, if we want to take a look at the resources, we can use the get-resource policy. We hit enter, and you can see in this case it just shows us the name on the left and the workload management policy that it's working with. You can see all of these are part of the default policy. So if you did want to make changes, you can create a new workload management policy, and then you can establish the changes within those policies and then apply them. So we're not going to get into that just yet, but this doesn't really give us enough information. If we use the pipeline and do a formatted list, you can see here that now, as we scroll up, you can see all of the different elements there and their thresholds. So you get a little bit more information. Personally, I prefer to see it in the nice chart in TechNet. It makes it a lot easier for me, but if you don't have that little chart in front of you, you can always jump into the Exchange Management Shell and grab that information from there. Now you might be thinking, well, okay, where's the GUI side to all of this? Well, that's the thing, is that a lot of this, all of this is really handled through the Exchange Management Shell. So gathering information and reports back your way, monitoring, all of that is going to be done through the shell. So let's jump back over to our slides and let's talk for a moment about a couple of commandlets that can help us when it comes to drawing information out of the system. So the system is doing all of this work in the background, but can we get some information about the server's health and get some reporting information back our way? Well, we can. Let's go find out how. There are commandlets that we can use, and we're going to talk about them in a moment, to adjust the settings for Exchange Workload Management. Whether it's system resources or user resources and throttling, there are commandlets for that. However, there are also commandlets for helping us when it comes to getting information or monitoring what is happening with our servers and with our end users. So one of the commandlets that we want to take a look at is the get-server health commandlet. This returns health information about the server you run it on or the server that you specify. So you can see here get-server health, and then you can provide the identity of the server. Now the commandlet will return an alert value with values that are either degraded, unhealthy, repairing, disabled, unavailable, or uninitialized. So it lets you know if there's a problem. There's another commandlet that can be very helpful. It's called get-health report. The get-health report returns health information about the server that you run it on or the server you specify. Now you might be thinking, wait a minute, that was the last commandlet. Well, actually, the get-server health is used to retrieve the raw health data, while the get-health report operates on the raw health data and provides a current snapshot of the health. So this commandlet returns an alert value with values that are the following: online, partially online, offline, sidelined, functional, or unavailable. Let's jump over to our server again, and let's use these two commandlets. You'll see how the get-server health returns a lot of raw data, and then you'll get a chance to see how using the get-health report really refines things and pulls it all together. Alright, so we want to view the health of our servers, and we can use the get-server health commandlet in order to help us to do that. But again, remember, we're going to look at the raw data first and then use the health report to kind of morph that data. So if we wanted to get the server health for, let's say, our mailbox server, so get-server health, and then we'll put in the name of the mailbox server, and we hit enter. Alright, you see it comes back with an awful lot of information. And we can scroll up and we can see this information as far as each of these different pieces, what's applicable, what's not, what's healthy, what isn't, and we can do that. Alright, so that's certainly great information. We appreciate that, but it doesn't really give us the whole view of things. So what if we did this? What if we went with the server health and then we pipeline this out to get health report? Well, now we see this is a little bit shorter. We get a little bit more information here that's digestible for us. We see the health set, the alert value, and all of this different information here for us. So you can see how, again, the get-health report takes that raw data and turns it into something we can use. So you can certainly go with get-server health. It gives you information, but get-health report kind of boils it down a little bit more. So let's take a look at this from a different perspective, because it might solidify the concept. The last thing I want is for you to walk away thinking that get-server health is raw data that's not helpful, and get-health report is really the end-all and be-all of things. Let's look at this by narrowing down what we're looking at. Here, if we type get-server health, and let's take a look at something specific. Let's take a look at the store process. So we would say where the health set name is the equivalent of store. So you can see here we're not using the get health report. We're just using get server health, and our goal here is to peer into further information about the store itself. We hit enter. Alright, and so it returns quite a bit of information to us. We see the alert value, the health set name. You can see further information here, the target resource and so forth. And we can go through this and we can see how that can be helpful to us. Now note the difference. If we use the exact same commandlet, but in this case pipeline it out to get health report. Okay, and so look what it does. It looks at the health set as a whole, and it tells us that things are healthy. Now that may be all that we need, but if something wasn't right, if it said it wasn't healthy, if something was coming back as an alert, well then we could go back, run the first command, and then see each item here and see what the target resource and the name of the process that's giving us the problem. So can you see now how these two tools do work together? That one provides a more verbose set of information and gives us a little bit more detail on what is healthy or unhealthy, and the other one provides a shorter list, a report list that just gives us a quick at-a-glance view of what is or isn't working on our system. Alright, so you can see again that we're using the Exchange Management Shell. There isn't a GUI side to this. Now, the various third-party vendors that make the monitoring tools for Exchange, they'll no doubt utilize the Exchange Management Shell commandlets, and they'll be able to tap into all of this and provide GUI-based screens for us to work with on the back end. But for now, you can see how you can tap into this using the get server health and the get health report commandlets. Let's jump back over to our slides and let's talk for a moment about other commandlets that can be used, because here we've been talking about how to monitor and review the various settings for the server health and so forth, but let's see how we might make changes to either the system policies, that is the workload and resource policies, or the user side policies, the throttling policies, when it comes to Exchange workload management. It is possible to change Exchange workload management. For servers, you can change the workload management policy settings. So you can use the new-resource policy or set-resource policy command. You can use the new-workload management policy, and then the new-workload policy, which then you assign to the management policy. And then ultimately you can use the set-exchange server and provide a new workload management policy. So you create the policies, you put them into management policies, and then you can assign them to the server. On the user side, you can control the user throttling settings using things like new-throttling policy, that's for creating the new policy, and then set-throttling policy association, which really connects the policy to the end users. So you use throttling policy association to associate the policy with the end user. To be honest, it's impossible to work through the various possibilities and examples. There are so many different ways you can use these commandlets to accomplish the goal of changing Exchange workload management. So rather than provide just one example that's very narrow focused, let's jump over to the Server Health Monitoring and Performance Commandlets page, and you'll see a good starting point for looking for information about these commandlets in the event you do wish to dive a little bit deeper on this. The important exam point to keep in mind here is that throttling, whether it's the throttling policy or a throttling policy association, that goes with user throttling. All the other commandlets, resource policy, workload management policy, workload policy, all of the resource and workload stuff, that goes with the systems and server side. So you have to keep these two separated in mind when you are faced with questions that relate to changing Exchange workload management. Alright, so here we are back in TechNet, and the article is Server Health Monitoring and Performance Commandlets. The URL will be provided at the end of the lesson in the additional research, but you can see it's not hard to find. You simply need to look under Exchange 2013 Commandlets, and you'll find it there. Now, as we look through this, you can see that there are a lot of different commandlets, but they're all pretty much under the same subject matter. We see throttling policy, throttling association, resource policy, workload management policy, workload policy, and if we go down a little bit more, we see things like server health, server component state, monitoring item help, and so forth. So it's not like there are thousands of different commandlets. However, the parameters can be a little bit more complicated. So for example, if we look at new throttling policy, Here we can see if we just look at syntax, look at the tremendous syntax that's involved in just a new throttling policy. So that could really put people off. That's not our goal. Our goal is not to scare folks. You can see that the nice thing is it provides an example here. There are several examples that can help you to see how you might use that new throttling policy, only if you really want to establish a new throttling policy. So that's really the key, is to make sure that this is something that you really want. If we click Set Throttling Policy, you can see additional syntax, additional examples, Get Throttling Policy, and you can see that that's pretty simple. Get dash throttling policy, format list, or you can look for a specific identity. So you look at that and you say, okay, we can work through this. What about workload policies or workload management policies? Well, again, those aren't too difficult to create. The workload management policy is pretty simple, but the new workload policy is a little bit more complex. If we click syntax, you see that there's quite a bit there, and you see a couple of different examples and how you might utilize the various parameters there. So there's a lot here, and that's why if you really need to dig deeper, you really need to spend some time reading through TechNet, going through these different commandlets and understanding how they work, how you can establish the scope of each of these different parameters, and how you might utilize this within your environment. The big question is why. You need to have a why factor for messing with all of this. Otherwise, you might tap into the server health or the health report, but otherwise, if you don't have a good reason as to why, then other than in a lab environment just to prove that you know how to use some PowerShell commands and you can make this work, well, in a production environment, you're really better off leaving these settings as is, unless you have a good reason to do otherwise. All right, let's jump back over to our slides and let's close out this discussion. So, in this lesson, as a consulting firm, we have reviewed the Exchange Management Workload features, and it's very clear that this is not something that we'll need to use often. We are, however, aware of its existence, and we know how to manipulate it should we need to. For additional research, we have 3 different articles in TechNet, 2 of which we actually took a look at during the lesson. The first is Exchange Workload Management. That's your starting point to dive deeper into the subject. Then there's the Workload Management Reference, and finally the Server Health, Monitoring, and Performance Commandlets. So we hope you found this informative. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next lesson.